In the previous lesson, we looked at how we can add these event listeners and essentially have these different events fire off whenever we had some interaction within our web page. So much like a lot of things in JavaScript, we've actually got several different ways that we can add these event listeners. So I'm going to keep these functions the same, and we're just going to simply reuse them and actually add event listeners to each one of these objects. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to identify the object. So just like what we did before where we had the myIMG, so I've got myIMG, and I'm going to actually do an add event listener. And what this does is this allows us to register an event listener on a single target, and this target could typically be an element. And the advantages of doing it this way is that we have the ability to add multiple event listeners, as well as have a lot more functionality within the events and have more control over the event listeners. So we can add them in, we can also remove these event listeners. And again, we can have multiple different types of event listeners. So we're going to do identifying it as an event listener, and we're going to register event listener of, I'm going to start off with click. And notice that this isn't on click, it's simply click. And then of course we have that same ability, same capability of typing in our function there. We can pass over that event information as well, just as we did within the other events. And we can console log out that event information. And of course we can update something like output and do the inner HTML. So actually have something happens whenever this event gets fired. Clicked. So now whenever we click the image, we're going to fire off that event, and we see that that's what gets fired off within our console. And of course we see that we've got an output update here to the inner HTML. So you're probably looking at this and saying, okay, well this does seem a little bit longer than what we were doing initially, where we were just doing the my image and we would add in that on click. And it's very true that this this does initially appear to be a longer way of doing the same type of functionality, but in fact when we do adding event listeners, we have some definite advantages over the on-click method. And one of the advantages is that on-click doesn't work across all browsers. So you may have some problems with some older versions of Internet Explorer, and some other browsers may not necessarily translate on-click as an add event listener. So the safest way to go when you're adding event listeners is to do it this way, to add event listener. And of course the other benefit of doing this is that when you add event listeners, you can add in actually multiple event listeners to that event. So if I want to fire off multiple functions, and I'll give you an example of that. So instead of, maybe I'll place this function on its own, pull that out, and do my fun 4. I think that's the next available one. And just tidy that up a little bit. So now I have the ability, so if I want to do on click and I want to write my fun, I can do it that way. I can fire it off, and as an event listener I can also attach it to my fun. But in addition to that, I don't have the ability to attach a second listener to it, but with this one I actually do. So just show you what the difference here is going to be. So space those out, and first of all we're going to run through those event listeners where we're not actually doing the adding event listener, where we're just adding the event within this type of functionality. And so for our event, we're firing this one off clicked, and maybe we'll update that output to clicked 2, and changing that background style. So here we're doing border, or maybe we can just keep that. So do background border blue. So let's refresh this and see what actually happens. So we've got it on the image, and whenever we click it, we see that we get this red border, and it seems to miss over the blue one as well. We get clicked, so we get the mouse coordinates and so on. So we don't actually get that first one. We don't see anything firing off. It's probably better if I do a console here. And I'm going to just type in my fun, and I need to quote around that because otherwise it's going to fire off that function that it's within. So maybe this is a better representation. So we'll just refresh that again, save it, refresh it, and now whenever we're over the object and we click it, we see that we're only firing off the my fun too. So, and as opposed to when we comment out that first way of clicking, I need to open that up again, refresh it, and now when we click on it, we see that we're actually firing off both those functions. So that's the main difference, is that it gives us the ability to fire off multiple event handlers and also added functionality, and also the ability to remove these event listeners. So an additional to advantages to the addEventListener is that semantics. So basically we see that we're actually registering that event, whereas over here we're not seeing that registration of the event. So sometimes there can be some confusion that these aren't actually events that are registered. So assigning the events via the addEventListener just makes a whole lot more sense. And again, of course, there's that compatibility with older browsers. So when in doubt, use the addEventListener. And if you're trying to create a quick project or just want some quick functionality to test out, then you can always go with the on-click way. So in the next set of lessons, we're going to be looking at even more detail, how we can update and interact with the DOM. So all of that is coming up in the next set of lessons.